Hello, I'm Ilana. Thank you so much for inviting me, Adriana. I was super excited about this opportunity because I haven't really, so oftentimes when you give an artist talk, you're speaking about yourself from like a kind of genesis moment and how I became who I am, like the making of Ilana, right? And you don't get invited necessarily to speak about new work or work that's kind of still in formation or in gestation. So I haven't really talked about the new work that I want to talk about with you all. But first I want to give a little bit of background. So I make work primarily in video and in sculpture, and oftentimes the sculptures I make are the props and the sets in my videos. And I like to say that I look a lot at like kind of aspirational media. So maybe like cooking shows, music videos, home improvement television, all of the things kind of sharing in common this a kind of a host or a star who has a perfect life and has perfect things, and has accrued those through maybe we would consider hard work or ingenuity. This narrative of like an American dream kind of story. And I also like to think about these kind of spaces of making or creation. So a kitchen, right? A sound stage. How are those things different from or similar to the tropes we have surrounding an artist studio, right? Maybe like this kind of white-walled cube within which like some sort of genius, right, is kind of making or creating. And so I like to think about those characters and the kind of fissures in them and the kind of limitations of these kind of idealized makers. I just wanted to show you one of the kind of sources of inspiration I had for the last piece that I made. Oops, no I don't.
Use the arrow at the back.
And then to play, I just click.
Yes.
When you use old wood, something happens. There's an honesty, a purity. It's authentic. It has a natural beauty and a patina that you cannot replicate with new timber. The salvaged timber is intrinsically better because the wood carries the marks of the passage of time. These timbers are from 100-year-old buildings that have been torn down in the UK. Old libraries, schools, distilleries, so they've got imperfections, cracks, knots, splits, but the outcome is no two tables are the same. When the timber comes in, it's hard to imagine you can ever make a table because they're all different sections, all different lengths and all different sizes. All beautiful, but it's all different. You've got columns, beams, trusses, joists, and each one is unique. The process of producing these salvage tables is incredibly difficult. You have to have an inherent understanding of how to handle reclaimed timber. First of all, you have to denail all the timber, which is an enormous job because you have to coax the nails out and still preserve the natural beauty of the timber. After denailing...
How are you all doing with audio? Can you hear what he's saying? No, not so well? Well, it's okay for this one because you can kind of get the gist of what's happening just by looking at it. But basically, these are videos that Restoration Hardware, the furniture design company, comes out with when they come out with a new line. And so I was particularly interested in this idea of the designer, right? Well, oftentimes these introductory videos kind of center around a designer in front of an infinity pool talking about where they find inspiration. And oftentimes, again, there's sort of this like genius moving through the world finding. And so there was this idea, this salvaged wood collection, which are like $2,000 tables made out of wood from old barn houses and things like that. And I was really interested in the role that nostalgia plays in these furniture lines and in the advertising of these things, that somehow the table is imbued with a sense of authenticity because it came from a kind of a bucolic natural landscape, or at least we kind of can imagine that it does. That it generates a sort of an heirloom. You get kind of like an heirloom without having to actually go to a flea market or have an old grandma who died. And so that there's this like idea of authenticity, right? He says there's nothing like old wood. It bears the marks of the passage of time. And I was thinking about this nostalgia and starting to work on the piece that I ended up making when I was living down in Virginia, and it was kind of election season, and I was living in Richmond, which is the capital of the Confederacy, and so sometimes it feels like a giant Confederate monument of a city or something like that. And so I started thinking about like what is the role of nostalgia in maybe like in the Northeast, or knew I was moving to I was moving up to Massachusetts, and that there's still this kind of idea that you could name the past as a success, and in so doing kind of have a sense of absolution, right? That by having this kind of keeping old things around you, it gives you an illusion of resolution of the past, and what is this impulse to kind of ingest the past and then move on? So I'll show you the video I made in response to these ideas, and hopefully the sound will do what we need it to do. There's nothing like old wood. It bears the marks of the passage of time. The new line will be a combination of every surface that's unresolved in the past and every space that's untapped in the present. Reparations will be our most ambitious project yet. We're going back to the source. Splintery, slippery materials. I find inspiration everywhere, and I take this inspiration with me back to the studio. When designing the new line, I asked myself, how could these newly free individuals make a space for themselves that was both free of discrimination, tasteful, and refined? Their liberation was handcrafted. I follow the process from beginning to end, searching the landscape of our nation for its most authentic histories. We'll begin with the basics. When designing the space, we decided that each family would have no more than 40 acres of tillable land. Engineered and made in the USA, they were built to exhausting standards. Reparations. What is it? It's a way to give back a little. With reparations, you can take the past into your home tastefully. Truly dealing with how we live, recognizing one another's differences, is something that hasn't happened yet. Until now. There's still time to make it right and to get the space you deserve. We've earned the right to the soil many times over and over, and now we're determined to have it. There's no force like success, And that's why we've made every effort to surround ourselves with evidence of it, in the home and in the nation. So I first kind of thought of the name or the title Reparation Hardware as sort of just a play on words, right? When I knew I was kind of using this brand as a jumping off point. But I started thinking about the notion of reparations, right, as you know, why are reparations so terrifying, right? In some ways, it's because they're an admission that the past was a failure, right? And not only was it a failure, it was a failure in economic terms, right? And that they're and a kind of an idea, a terrifying promise that to reconcile this would require a certain kind of loss, a loss of capital on the part of those who kind of benefited, right? And so by buying a nice table, right, maybe you can name the past as a success, but you can also perhaps you can absolve yourself of guilt without necessarily letting go of money, right, capital, or giving away money. That, you know, oftentimes, especially maybe in like, in the world of like benevolent brand, maybe like New York branding, right, there's this idea that you can kind of buy your way out of guilt. And so when I showed that piece originally, I showed it in a space, Larry in Chinatown, and kind of built my own imaginary reparation hardware store with tables that were built out of the barn that you saw the video shot in. And I showed this video also, which is a kind of a rumination on the catalogs that Restoration Hardware comes out with, which are these really thick, meaty catalogs. I don't know if I'm blocking the view of the text. Can you see it? It's fine? So in this piece, I've combined text from the Federal Housing Authority's guidelines on giving out home loans during the 1940s, and text from the introduction to the catalog by the CEO of the company. So I'll let you read a little bit of the lines. So in this, you know, oftentimes my scripts come from a mashup of kind of like contradictory or conflicting texts, different perspectives on the same thing. And so, you know, we're thinking about the housing guidelines, and we think about this idea of redlining, right? Who and who not to give home loans to, right? And so, you know, basically, are there people of color there? Okay, no loans, right? But also the kind of hinting, the kind of aesthetic hints that they kind of drop to name this, and like kind of a moral association with certain aesthetics, right? So to keep out undesirable elements, you might want to be near a hill or a ravine. Are the trees ordered? Do they look good? Who are you seeing around, right? These are guidelines for a loan officer. And they speak to this idea of design, right? Designing perfection and designing perfect communities. And the CEO will quote like Steve Jobs talking about ratcheting up our species through design. So I want to move forward to the next thing that I've been thinking about, which is that I don't know if any of you have been there, but Restoration Hardware opened up this new mega store kind of near the Whitney in the meatpacking district recently. And so it's been under construction for a really long time. And so they had to kind of defy a lot of zoning laws or work around a lot of zoning laws to be able to exist, because it's 6 stories high.
We're gonna look online and find a cool bed.
So it's 6 stories high. It's like really grandiose. You can order at a wine bar, you can order a glass of rosé and walk around the store while looking at furniture. There's like a rooftop restaurant. And I think a lot of these things were used to kind of work around, like, is this entirely a retail space, you know? And so it's almost like a haunted house of like high-end design. If you go in there, there's something definitely super intimidating. But I started imagining what I could do inside of this sort of a showroom. And so I've been kind of sneaking around the store, shooting up my own kind of video or version of a promotional video for this new space. Here's some more footage of it. So you get the idea. I got really interested in these objects that they have around the space that are kind of, they'll look like they're from a far off land, right? They'll have Buddhas, they'll have African masks, they'll have things like that. And when I asked the store clerks, who will only call the store a gallery, they won't call it a store, where they came from, they say, we have members of our team that we send out around the globe to find these objects. And they bring them back, and the ones that speak most to our CEO, we show in the space, and they're not for sale, but if you really want, we can look into pricing. And it had me thinking, here's like some that are also in the catalog, and it had me thinking about this, how this kind of functions in a much longer history of design. I had met an art historian named Christina Wilson who was writing about mid-century modern furniture design and advertising, and it's surprising how much it hasn't changed at all. And so those designers, whether it be the Eameses or others, would talk about going to Mexico and traveling there to find inspiration as well. And they'd also speak about putting these objects in their showrooms and them not being for sale, and saying that they were there to kind of add variety. But there's also this kind of way one might imagine these objects sort of like reinforce the idea of the whiteness of the furniture itself, or the whiteness as like a kind of firm line, or they'll speak about how they kind of bounce around inside of, how they kind of, the objects they accrued from around the world kind of bounce around inside of this white cube and are therefore kind of made to be under control. And so, it's kind of, it's the same thing going on. And so I started making these replicas of the objects that they have in the space. And I'm working on shooting a video where I kind of go out into the world and become this kind of discoverer of things. I'm going to go to Mexico next month and see if I can pretend to dig them up. And so I've been shooting out on the patio here and stuff, sort of. So I'm here on the deck patio of Restoration Hardware, shooting some footage. You can get. So I've been pretending to be the CEO, talking about where I'll find these things in the world, and you see they have these like kind of crazy quotes from the CEO on the walls, like, we respect the hierarchy between architecture, furniture, and decor that creates hierarchy. I love this one. The most pleasing environments are a reflection of human design, a study in balance, symmetry, and perfect proportions. So they're kind of right there boldly and like centered, this idea of human design. I've also been visiting a house up in Williamstown that's a kind of period mid-century modernist house, kind of near where I'm living in Massachusetts. And so I'll also be shooting some footage in there. You can see, maybe you can't see, but a lot of similar objects are also situated in this home or this space. But yeah, that's where I'm at right now. The footage is still kind of coming together, but I'm really excited to kind of go out and pretend to be this explorer. I think she'll also be like sort of an Instagram travel vlogger, So I'm thinking about maybe like drinking some matcha lattes out of this thing too, and capturing that in a photograph, and seeing how I could kind of mash up those two ways of speaking about travel and accruing experience and accruing taste through objects. Yeah, thank you. So am I heading out, or am I doing a question thing?
Does anyone have any questions? We can take maybe one or two questions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah?
I was just curious if you could speak more to the materials used to make the cameras and their operation
Yeah, a video that I made earlier was a kind of a cooking show video, and I started making my own tools for those things. These props that I call dysfunctional ceramics. So, you know, maybe a double-ended spoon that couldn't necessarily perform its duty or would have to like force you to have a certain, to take a different stance, or, you know, a cup with a hole in it, right? And so I got really interested in this idea of a ceramic hammer, right? Because it's this tool that undoes itself through its very use. And thinking about that in the context of, you know, very much thinking about failure in lots of different ways in that video, and maybe thinking about this sort of American project of prosperity as also a tool that kind of undoes itself through its very use. Yeah.
I missed most of your talk, but I just was wondering, where do you plan to display these artifacts once you've made them?
Yeah, so I'm not sure actually with this one if I'm even going to display them outside of the space of the video. A lot of the times that's always a tension for me, is whether or not the sculptures are going to be seen at the same moment as the video is. And a lot of that comes from the idea that I'm interested in the capacity of the lens to make even the most mundane surfaces look glamorous. So even if obviously you can see the craftsmanship is a little bit wonky or something, that when I place it in like a scenic beach, right, it becomes something more than itself, that you could like light a turd with really good lighting and it would look delicious, right? So like I kind of want to keep the fantasy going often, and that's why I don't necessarily show the objects out in the world. Yeah. Hi.
Hi, I'm just wondering, because you started talking about authenticity and nostalgia, what your thoughts are about how the framework around the maker, the artisan and craftsman is approached by both restoration hardware, and what you think is happening in terms of the larger conversation in the art community.
It's like the kind of,
display of the artist.
yeah, the display of the artist, or like, you know, if you read a profile of an artist and it's like it's not pictures of their work, it's like pictures of them looking beautiful in their studio, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of investment in knowing where the artist comes from, what their race, culture is, and how that informs the way we think of authenticity in terms of product.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I think about it even as myself as these characters or something inside of the videos, right? That oftentimes, perhaps we expect like the artist to give the viewer a window into their world that they come from. You know, that maybe like my job might be to give a presumed white audience a window into the African American experience via my work. And so oftentimes I actually like to imagine myself performing a certain brand of impossible whiteness in the work, right? Kind of shining a light on that, whether that is like a cooking show host with a perfect life, or this kind of person who's surrounded by perfect design. That I actually kind of like to shed a mirror on that, and also kind of not necessarily decenter my experience, but rather like kind of destabilize what we consider to be the center. If that makes sense? Cool. Well, thank you all.